As head of consumer banking for Standard Chartered and UOB, he has led complex billion-dollar businesses through challenging times. Dr. Dennis Khoo has 3 decades of industry experience in IT and finance. He drove the development of a popular and widely used banking app here in Singapore by looking away from conventional wisdom. He has written 2 books on digital transformation, and now he's designed a program for senior leaders who want to lead digital transformation. How is it structured to help leaders with the challenge of managing disruption successfully? What does Dennis think are the drivers for digital revolution in the near future? Let's find out with Dr. Dennis Khoo. Good to meet you.
Same here, Michelle.
All right, let's start with the definitions. So the program is about digital transformation. How useful is this term? And what do we even mean when we talk about digital transformation?
That's a really good question to start with, because I think the term has become more of a misnomer, and it means a lot of different things. At one end of the spectrum, it can be really simple, right? You just want to convert paper forms to digital. On the other end of the spectrum, it can be a complete organization-wide, company-wide transformation. So I think the misnomer is really about the fact that it's not just using digital to transform a company. It takes much more than that in terms of the people, the process, the mindset shifts, the capabilities, of which technology plays a big role.
So are there things that need to be put in place, though? Is there a clue hidden in the word digital transformation? Do you have to digitize or digitalize before that can happen? What are the definitions, the definitional differences, I guess, of these terms?
I think one of the basic steps is, of course, if everything is analog, right? Everything is paper, there's nothing on a computer, then there are some fundamental steps to be taken. I mean, today, the practical reality is that most larger companies are already digitized. It'll be hard to find even a medium-sized company that is not using any computers at all. Mm-hmm. So I think we would restrict that to mostly very small businesses. And today, most startups would start already digitized. So I think the playing field has developed significantly over the past 10 years. And therefore, I think when we talk about mid to larger companies, we're really referring to much more than just digitization. We're talking about, especially in today's world, right, where sustained competitive advantage is fleeting, where competitors can pop up from anywhere, not just in your industry, also outside your industry. And therefore, the ability to basically transform your business continuously over time. And the ingredients you need there go back to the people, understanding the customer, understanding the business model, and of course, developing new capabilities. But the word has become a misnomer in the sense that it's given the impression that with just capabilities, you can transform a business or an organization.
So you mentioned, who will lead your organization's transformation. So let's talk about the you. Who should take charge? Who should be leading this transformation?
Well, to me, there are really 2 very key participants for a complex, and most incumbent companies are complex. Mm-hmm. You've got existing process, existing infrastructure, existing mindset. If you've been very successful, you have existing paradigms. Just getting the employees to look at things from a different perspective can be a very big challenge. So that, I think, leads to the conclusion that you need a very senior sponsor that's prepared to move aside internal constraints, the established thinking, the established process, or perhaps you now need more attention to detail than you did before. So I think the internal sponsor is either going to be the CEO or someone very, very senior working for the CEO that's very well regarded and very respected in the organization, because he's got the shift mindsets. And I think that can be a real challenge for most of us, because humans don't like change, and undergoing that process can be very painful. The second key person, I think, is the Chief Transformation Officer. And there's a wide range of roles you can pick the transformation officer from. It could be someone in technology, more often it's someone in the business. It could be someone that is very familiar with the operations. And one of the things that I find as you rise to the top to take these jobs, the chief transformation officer job, is that you need to be very broad. And most people may not have had the breadth as they rise to the top. So those are the two, I think, very important positions to consider.
Is it useful for a company to think of siloing off this operation, having a start-up within the company, or is that not useful to the whole process of transformation?
I think there are circumstances where that makes sense, where you're doing something completely different. Perhaps there's not much synergy with the mother at all. So you're going into an area that's really a different product for a different market. And I think then isolating the group, because one of the things that people underestimate is the kind of culture you need. And so you want to isolate it fundamentally because you want a different way of looking at things, you want a different culture. And that could be a reason to do that. But I find that most incumbent companies, they are not doing something that is really 180-degree different. And therefore, there are certain leverages by putting it as a unit within the organization. And there's another very important reason, because you really want the transformation effects to eventually permeate throughout the mother organization. And therefore, if you separate it, then you'll find difficulty in pulling all that knowledge, learning, and cultural aspects back to the mother, because you'll be seen as, well, this is a kind of a foreign entity. So from that perspective, if the objective is really to either permeate the mother with the daughter's attributes eventually, or eventually grow the daughter to become the mother, then I think a closer association is required, and therefore you cannot hive it off.
We'll talk about the cultural aspects in a while, the corporate culture. But first, can you share with us about the statistics behind this? Why is it so many companies fail when it comes to digital transformation? What do the stats tell us?
Well, the stats from all research, whether you look at the major management consulting companies like Bain, BCG, McKinsey, or you look at any research that has been done on the topic, you'll find that the majority of transformations fail. Between 70 to 92% of transformations don't meet their objective. And in our work in this area, my co-author Jun Kyu and I have basically peeled the onion on this and found that there are 5 major reasons. The first is putting the solution before the problem. You're not clear what the problem is, but there's so many solutions floating out there. The second is really overwhelmed by the complexity that we discussed. The third is really treating it as mostly a technology issue. Number 4, while you may have many ideas, ideas are not innovation. And in order for an idea to become an innovation, you need to pass through 3 hurdles. It must be desirable, it must be viable, it must be feasible. And the final reason, number 5, is something I think everybody's familiar with, is really the lack of the talent. How do you assemble the talent? And also, I alluded to this earlier, that at the top of the transformation team, you've got to be very broad. But you also need people who are experts in certain areas. And this breadth and depth must come together as an organization.
Really exciting. So when we think about the reasons for failure, what do you think seems to be most prevalent in terms of the examples that you've come across? You mentioned cart before the horse, thinking of the solution before identifying the problem. Can you give us some examples there?
I would say that the top 3 are probably solution before the problem, the fact that treating it as mostly a technology issue, and complexity. Solution before the problem, I think, is something that many companies experience. The executives, the CEO may be out there attending a conference and the topic's on AI. And when he comes back, he's saying, okay, we got to do AI, right? It's the in thing. And of course, if the CEO says, let's do AI, everybody's going to fall in line and say, okay, let's do AI. But when you ask companies, so what problem are you trying to solve? Very often, they don't really understand the problem fully. And one thing that we are trying to bring across to participants of our program is that unique problems need unique solutions. So as an example, when I was designing Tomorrow, we had a choice of taking transactional data and using that transactional data to improve banking experience, or we could take deals, merchant offers, and make those offers available to customers. So without understanding what is the problem you're trying to fix and what problem is more valuable, more desirable, it's not possible to come with a solution. And often when you develop a solution in the vacuum of the problem, you often find that you have to write off the solution. And most people don't realize the extent to which you need to customize something that's fit for purpose. So if it's not customized for that, if it's been customized with some other, perhaps more generic use in mind, you may not be able to use a solution that you have invested in. And that's part of R&D, right? R&D has a high failure rate, and you often have to change what you're doing. And hence, back to your question about the success rates, a lot of this is written off.
So when it came to that example, for example, transactional data or sort of heat map of deals, how did you decide which one to go with?
Well, we looked at all the different dimensions, right? From a customer perspective, what was more valuable? We looked at, from a business model perspective, what was more aligned with the business model we wanted. And of course, once you get those two elements in sync, then you can begin to understand the capabilities you need, as I mentioned. So for us, I think the decision was made because we generate tons as banks, right? We generate tons of transactional data. And if you think about it, we don't do much with that transactional data today. We keep it for a number of years as required by regulators. It's mostly used to generate statements and mostly used when you turn up at the bank, maybe years later, to say that you didn't make this transaction. We can then pull that out and verify whether you did or not. But there's a very simple example of how you can really put some of these data into action, right? Today, if a transaction fails, and usually a transaction fails because you've got a number of accounts. One of those accounts is probably linked to your salary. Another account may not, but they may have debits hitting those accounts, and we all face that, right? And suddenly you get a failed transaction. Now, a bank knows, most businesses of this nature would know that the transaction is going to fail because we can see the pattern, right? You have a debit coming in and there's not enough money. So we can actually alert you to say that, well, a debit's going to come in tomorrow based on regular patterns and it's going to fail. So click here to fund the account and maybe even transfer a regular amount over so that it doesn't happen again. So it's a very simple use of data, and we eventually made the decision because we were generating so much data ourselves. Whereas when you look at merchant data, you have to acquire that data. You have to make deals with merchants.
You'd be dependent on a third party.
That's not impossible to do, but we felt that transactional data was so much more of a low-hanging fruit, right, and would add so much more to creating a bank that was really easy to use.
And could anticipate needs.
And could anticipate, exactly. So you have different tiers, right? At the base is really basic banking that is so easy to use. Banking should have always been this way. And one tier up is that if a problem does happen, right, how do I fix it quick so you don't have to repeat anything? And finally, the holy grail, right, is really where you use data to prevent problems from happening.
All right, you mentioned the statistics, and it seems quite alarming, the number of businesses that fail in their digital transformation efforts. Now, who should be responsible when those failures occur?
Well, for me, it would definitely rest on the top management, because it is the top management that is in a position to look at things very holistically. And what we have found is that That is what is missing today, a holistic approach. And we are not talking about simple digital transformations, like the example I gave, right? Just converting paper forms to digital. We are talking about really organizational change, being more competitive, serving customers better. And that really requires the top management to take into account the many different elements and dimensions in a large company, right? So what segments do you want to serve? What gaps are there? What new insights have you discovered? What experience do you want to bring, right? And very importantly, what is the process? Process is a step that I think most companies miss out. Because without the process, what are you automating? You're really automating the process. Now, that's a whole chunk of work, and that's really focused around the customer. But you can focus something around the customer and not make any money. And most commercial companies are for profit. And so you've then got to think about the business model. And the business model we've found really encompasses 4 key things, which are quite commonplace. Differentiation, are you differentiated from the competition? Path to profit, can you make money at a time frame commensurate with your risk-taking ability? Scaling, right? Can you scale this to a total profit that you've budgeted for? And finally, what's the core competence gap in order to bring this about, right? Is the gap too big? And therefore, you have to stage it. Now, the most executives would have heard of these 4 points. The interesting thing they may not be aware of is that these 4 are what I call connected dials. As you turn one dial, say differentiation, path to profit moves, right? As you turn scaling, your core competence gap may shift. If you turn it down, your differentiation, right? If you turn core competence gap down, for example, your differentiation may reduce. So there's no way to turn everything to the right. As you turn one, the others turn. So it's a process of trade-off and fine-tuning that can be quite bewildering for most executives. And then you've got to make sure that these two snap together like jigsaw puzzles, right? The very strong CVP that customers are willing to pay for their problem to resolve, as well as a superior business model can snap together. And then you have the right starting point to start thinking about what are some of the capabilities we need to build this proposition and this business model.
Dennis, in your mind, is there a roadmap for transformation?
Michelle, that's a really good question. And what my co-author and I, Jun Kyu, have done is we've put together what we feel is the first holistic, structured, step-by-step methodology for digital transformation. And what it entails is it looks at customers, which is needed to produce a very strong customer value proposition. It looks at business, because that's needed for a very strong business model. And it looks at the capabilities you need. For example, you need to be able to design something well. You need to adopt new methodologies. You, of course, need to look at data. You need to look at information technology, the ecosystem around your industry, and you may need certain new disciplines. And finally, we looked at people and leadership. So these 4 dimensions plus the 19 elements that go under these dimensions and the considerations that you need to think about when you put all these things together, we believe is very unique. And it separates itself from many other ways of approaching digital transformation or business transformation in the industry today that are very siloed, that basically look at things from the standpoint of only digitization or only marketing, right? Or only from a design thinking perspective or from an agile development perspective. These are not holistic approaches in that sense. And complex transformations, we very strongly believe to remove those 5 major causes of failure need holistic approach. And this holistic approach has been put together based on our experiences in running large complex businesses, but also in helping companies transform and of course, my experience building Tomorrow by UOB.
You mentioned a holistic approach. How important is it to get an entire company on board digital transformation then?
Well, the bigger the transformation effect that you're looking for, right? I think the more important it is to engage the entire company. Of course, if you're starting small, like in a bank, for example, right? You might choose the smallest segment you have.
Right.
Let's say you're a bank that's universal, so you're doing everything, but the smallest segment you have is, let's say, in small and medium-sized banking.
Right.
And you want to start there first. And that's a good daughter-mother analogy, right? So you might have a separate unit, a different culture from the mother, right? Yet borrow things you can from the mother, like you might not need a finance team. You might be able to have someone seconded from the compliance team. So that's starting in a much more manageable way. And therefore, if you contrast that to an organization-wide change that's needed, maybe because of competitiveness is dropping or profits are dropping, then you have to engage the entire company because everybody is going to be concerned about change. Change means that I might have a different boss, I might have a different career, I might not have a job in the change. So people get worried. And when people get worried, they become an obstacle in the change that you seek. So then, yes, you have to engage the entire company, keep them updated. You might have to retool, bring in new capabilities. But very importantly, right, what are you actually trying to solve? Because you may have a wide range of options, each with a different corresponding business model that needs different capabilities. So all this has to come together.
What needs to happen with the corporate culture to manage change, to manage the sense of loss that comes with change that leads to obstacles?
First, it's very important to have a very clear narrative. And what do I mean by narrative? The purpose, right? Why are we doing it? Are we doing it because other people are doing it? That's the worst kind of narrative because when trouble hits, you begin to question why you did it in the first place because your intent was not clear. So what's the purpose? And purpose also needs to have an element that's inspiring because what you're trying to do is attract builders. And builders are slightly different in the sense that they are not just incented by the at the topmost priority by money. So they want to know, what are we doing that is going to help the world, that's going to help the industry, and so that you've got to imbue that into your purpose. And then you've got to have a clear ambition. And then, very importantly, you've got to establish the value system. Because when you bring a bunch of very talented people together, people often don't focus on the dark side, right? They will be potentially ambitious. They would have climbed up. They might think they know everything there is to know. They might, for example, not assimilate well the culture. They might not listen well. So these values and cultural aspects help to shield the worst and bring out the best in people. And then, of course, the measurements. So having that narrative very clear is important because there's usually a lot of miscommunication when you start a transformation. People are not clear what we're trying to do. And then there's a lot of hearsay.
And why.
And why. And so the why, the what, the how, I think that has to be very clear in the narrative. And that's not all, right? Because part of what you're trying to do is create a more innovative culture. And so in a more innovative culture, you've got to reduce the importance of hierarchy. Because hierarchy actually runs counter to being innovative. From the standpoint that one of the things I do when I'm trying to promote more inclusiveness and more innovative culture is to encourage everybody to ask why. And that's very powerful because if the culture is to ask why, then you can't hide behind seniority. No matter how senior you are, you have to answer the question, right? And we are now talking about doing things based on merit, not based on seniority. And that's very powerful because number one, younger staff, people who just join, feel that they can contribute, they can add. Number two, no matter how senior you are, you have to justify, you have to explain. That explanation also helps people understand, hey, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And then people become more passionate, more motivated because they feel that their opinion matters. So there's a lot more right? But these are some of the very basic aspects of how you need to bend the incumbent culture that may have become a bit more complacent, right? Success always breeds complacency. Once you're successful, you may be locked into a certain paradigm. You see the world only from that lens. And one of the important aspects of business transformation is changing the lens you view the world. Because if you don't change that lens, then whatever you do is still going to be very similar to what you're doing right now.
So you have to lead with questions.
Yes, that's very important. Leading with questions. And one of the aspects of people who do complex transformations well, that is really the concept of, can you think from a systems-wide perspective? And within that is the comfort with ambiguity, right? I don't really know the answer to this, but we'll find out, right? We'll overcome it rather than trying to rush into an answer too quickly. Because when you do that, right, you're just sweeping under the carpet. But later, when the carpet is removed, then all that comes back. So there's really no way for you to sometimes wish all the problems away by quickly, gravitating around simple answers. Sometimes a complex problem needs a more sophisticated solution.
So sit with the ambiguity.
Yes.
You've led complex billion-dollar organizations, but some companies may just be starting on their journey. What is your advice to them?
Well, it depends if they're starting like a startup with no baggage, right? Now that's very different because you've got few people. You've got, for example, no software, no code. Perhaps you have no process, you have no infrastructure. So when you have nothing, right, you have nothing holding you back. Take another extreme where you've already become established. You're a mid-sized company, right? You have a lot of processes, right? You have a lot of infrastructure. You have a lot of set ways of doing things, right? You have probably already thought through your hierarchy, your decision-making processes.
Yeah.
So your starting point is very important. What we find is that for people who are more startups, they need to get the customer problem clear and the business model clear. But they have less problem with capabilities, right? Because, for example, if you're a software as a service company, you should know how to write software. I mean, if you don't know how to write software, then you have a problem. So generally, therefore, IT, data, right? The methodologies they need to adopt, those tend to be less of a problem for them. If you are a mid-size or larger incumbent company, then all of it comes into play, right? The existing talent that you have, what needs to be upgraded? Who are you going to choose to lead this transformation that has the breadth of experience to tackle the problems you're going to face? You may not know the customer very well by then, right? Because all companies, as they grow, they become very internalized. You worry about resource allocation internally. Every company will have its degree of people who are jostling for positions, for resource. You have existing stakeholder pressures. So all these might get in the way, and therefore thinking through, spending more time with customers that you may have neglected. Understanding the new business model. Are you going to make money a different way, right? Understanding then the capabilities that you need, and then putting all that together will become very essential. So the starting point is very critical. And I would add one final thing, that a lot of the examples we see that we read today are startup examples.
Yeah.
And incumbent companies take those examples and then feel that they can be startups. Now, there's nothing wrong with adopting certain ways of working that startups have, right? So design thinking may have started with some of the startups, and then it's really now become more and more embedded. And design thinking is simply more about how do you center your approach, your design around the customer.
And the needs of the customer.
The needs of the customer, rather than the needs of the inventor.
Right.
Right? Because the inventor may not get it right. The inventor may be a small group of customers, may be very unique. So these, what I call methodologies, which is one of the elements in the capabilities I mentioned, you can definitely learn how to use some of these new methods. But incumbent companies are really not startups. You've got to think through the whole lot of process you have, right? And first of all, has your process even been fine-tuned recently, right? Because if you're going to automate a process that has not been re-engineered for today, you're just going to make the problem worse, right? Because the process has become more efficient, but has not taken into account all the different problems that customers experience. So this would be, I think, critical in terms of understanding where you start and therefore how you need to progress. And I'll add just one final point that I think is critical, right? Most companies need to revisit actually what business am I in and therefore what changes am I going to make. If you imagine a very simple 2x2 matrix on the vertical axis is, are there a few things you can do to completely change the performance curve of your business?
Okay.
So at one end, in the top half, would be, yes, there's one or two things I can do. At the bottom would be, no, actually there isn't such a thing. I might have to take 20 smaller problems and string them together, sequence it right, so that the experience becomes great. On the horizontal axis, again, you have two components. One is, can you basically switch? Can customers switch easily? Are there a lot of barriers to switching? So those two factors would be, yes, easy to switch, like a cup of coffee. Drinking another cup of coffee from another vendor is a very easy switch, right? You don't have anything that would kind of hold you back. But if you take a bank, for example, you're going to have to redo some of your payments. You're going to get used to a new app. If you think of mobile phones, right? Android users and iPhone users, a completely new way to navigate, right? So that can be a very challenging experience that users won't want to go through. So then you end up with 4 different quadrants you could be in. A lot of companies actually, surprisingly, they think they are what I call in the breakthrough quadrant. That means they can do 1 or 2 things and there's very little resistance to adoption. But not many companies are actually in the breakthrough quadrant. You do have, and they tend to be companies that are in technology space, because obviously, if you're going to find 1 or 2 things, then certain developments have to be happening very rapidly. One of them is the science. The science is moving very quickly, right? Today, you find a lot of developments in genetics, in how the understanding of the human genome has really advanced. You look at a very recent case of the vaccines. That's coming from really scientific development, material science to combat all the problems we're having with global warming. So those are industries where the science is moving very, very rapidly. You could also have sometimes temporary situations where the business model is evolving, like Airbnb versus hotels.
Okay.
Right? So those are the breakthrough quadrant. Many incumbent companies think they're in breakthrough quadrant, but actually, they are what I call the experience quadrant, like banks. There's really no one thing you can do when you launch a digital bank to attract all the clients you want. Other than doing something silly like giving loans for free and then giving very high interest rates for deposits, which is going to, of course, destroy your business model. You make customers very happy, but the business model is not sustainable. And so in that quadrant, the experience quadrant, you can't just do one thing, but do 20, 30, maybe each individually could be just pet peeves. But when you assign the right order to those pet peeves and you create the experience around streamlining them, that's where customers feel a significant leap in their experience.
For a long time, we were debating whether the retail brick and mortar bank would have a future with fintech and disruption. And then we see banks becoming fintechs almost. I'd love to pick your brain. What do you think are the 3 big trends that will push forward digital revolution in finance?
For me, my experience, basically tells me that Finance, if you ask a banker, right, what industry are you in, you might get a lot of different answers. I'm in the risk management business, I'm in the technology business, right? I'm helping people, with their lives, like in wealth management. But to me, the essence of financial services, especially in retail and SME, is really a service, right? It's a service, and you don't produce any end product. You're really facilitating the end consumption that the customer is trying to address. And therefore, if you view it from that perspective as a service, right, then the whole thinking around process becomes very important. Design becomes very important. And if you contrast that with Apple, for example, right? Apple and the iMac or the Mac Air, PCs have been around for potentially 30 years, right?
So have tablets, yeah.
Yeah. So why is Apple so successful?
Yeah.
It's because Apple focuses on the experience. Apple focuses on how the software, the hardware, and the firmware, how they all come together. And Apple agonizes at the small detail, right? How curved should the phone be? And I don't know if you realize this, but if you turn on your Apple iPhone Touch,
Okay.
the button on the icon actually moves up and down. And I always use this as an example to illustrate the amount of detail that Apple goes into, right? So if you're in the experience business, therefore, you must be very good at process, and therefore, you must also be very good at detail, because it links back to what I said earlier, right? You don't have one big thing. It's 20, 30 small things. And if you don't have attention to detail, then you're not going to be able to string them together to provide a great experience. So from that standpoint, I think for banking, experience is the key. And then leveraging digital, leveraging technology to make the processes faster, more foolproof, and potentially at lower cost. So for example, designing a chatbot for banking.
Okay.
Most chatbots don't work, right? I mean, you might have experienced it yourself in the sense that when you go to any site, they will ask you, Michelle, do you want to use our chatbot? And likely you'll say no because you've had a bad experience where they couldn't understand what you wanted.
This is
Then they might
true.
ask you again, right? Are you sure you don't want to use it? You say, no, I want to speak to somebody.
Yes.
And when you look at things from that context, right, and you go a bit deeper, you realize that what you need to do is actually, you need to make sure that the bot understands what you want. And so when we set out to use chat as a superior channel, we had to educate and teach the chatbot first. And we started this in Thailand, right? So you had to teach the chatbot 25,000 Thai phrases, and every month subsequently teach it many more. And over time, it learns to understand what you're asking, right? And most companies haven't focused on that. And that's why the chatbot performs so poorly. So again, I'm bringing this example because it illustrates the detail, the thoughtfulness that you need to go into. And that's what you need if you're in the experience quadrant. So if you buy my thought process that banking is really a service and experience, then this is really what's needed for it to be successful. You contrast that with a breakthrough business model, right? You just need to get a few things right. You don't have to get 20, 30 things right. For Netflix to have won in the battle against Blockbuster or any other video rental service, they needed bandwidth, right? Otherwise, you won't be able to stream it. You need titles, because one of your proposition is never turn up at the store and have a video you want to rent unavailable, right? And then it's that, and really about the way you price it as a subscription. So they've done very well in the sense that if you look at their content, and I was a subscriber when Netflix was available in the US, and then when they came to Singapore, I didn't take up the subscription anymore, and then recently got back, and you could see the amazing shift in the content that's happened, right? Yeah. And so when you are in a Blockbuster quadrant, you just need to focus on those couple of things that can really transform your price performance. And so, again, for banking, right, I would say it's less about technology. In fact, I would say that if you get design correct, if you get process correct, technology in a bank is really not that difficult once you get those two pieces correct. Technology in the bank is difficult because the back end is very complicated. There's never been an SAP of banking, right? Where you have SAP for manufacturing, it can cover a lot of the functions needed for a manufacturing company. But there hasn't been such a software in the history and how banking developed, right? So you may have in a large regional bank 100 different systems at the back.
Okay.
And they all need to be connected together. And you can't make any mistakes. You can't give someone 1 cent less, right? You can't have the wrong customer logged into the wrong account. And so the back end is very complicated. But once you are able to streamline the back end, and then you're able to expose the back end using what is commonly called application programming interfaces, the front end isn't that difficult. The front end is really an attention to design and process. So I differ in the sense that banks, to me, are not good at developing software as a product, right? We are integrators of software by nature. And therefore, we don't have a product roadmap. Some of the maintenance of that code from so many hundreds of systems, banks find it very difficult to manage. And in my view, banks should stick to experience and not focus on becoming a software company, because other companies are better at doing that.
If we moved away from finance, a lot of people are wondering whether understanding conversation, Twitter, great example, a platform where people converse naturally, whether that's going to be key to unlocking chat boxes and, how algorithms are able to respond to you through any sort of interface. I wonder, what do you think are the top 3 digital trends that perhaps will shape this revolution in the near future?
But algorithm will definitely be one of them. In fact, we are already controlled by algorithm. If you, like getting here, right? I got in my car and it was proposing a different path that I would normally take. And that's an algorithm. It's fed by data. The data could be, traffic data that has indicated that there's certain, traffic that you need to avoid in the normal route you would take. So our world is really going to be increasingly run by algorithm. And of course, the technology behind a lot of those algorithms is machine learning, is AI. But again, to the question you just asked, right? A lot of those algorithms need to learn. And therefore, teaching those algorithms, what I've already highlighted in my example, the chatbot, become critical. Because if you don't train the algorithms start off in a way very basic and not able to handle anything more sophisticated than the most basic problems. So algorithm and the way algorithms are going to influence almost every aspect of our lives would definitely be one of the key trends, and most people refer that as the AI trend or the machine learning trend. For me, I think the 2 other trends have very different characteristics and very different origins. To me, the next 2 are really more around the cure for cancer, right? How science today is increasing understanding how the body works. The body has probably 75 trillion cells, in our body, and how that works, and how you can understand how the switches in our DNA, sometimes which are inadvertently turned off, how does that affect diseases like cancer? And the third one to me will be material science, because what the world faces a very severe problem in global warming, the excesses of growth. When there's too much growth, there's too much consumption. And today, one of the things you're able to do, which you weren't able to do just maybe a mere 300 years ago, you're able to consume for the future because you can borrow. As you borrow, you consume more. And as you consume more, we pollute the earth. And so material science is important because we need to figure out a way to sequester carbon dioxide and manage carbon dioxide better. Because we have basically broken that cycle, and it's coming back to haunt us, and you read about this every day in the newspaper. So to me, really information and algorithms, the human genome and how we can leverage that, and material science to really resolve some of the toughest problems that humans have created for themselves.
Absolutely fascinating. Your program is going to appeal to senior leaders who want to solve the tough problem of managing change. Who is the sort of person who is going to be able to do well in your program?
Great question. A lot of people may think that you need to be someone who's very digitally inclined. And the answer is no. Number one, you have to be someone who's curious, who's inquisitive, who wants to understand why. You're someone who believes in the fundamentals, that it all starts with the customer. Are you solving a problem that's valuable to the customer? Because if you are, and customers appreciate that, and customers advocate that, then you're on your way, right, to winning in competition. So the qualities we are looking for are really someone who wants to view the problem holistically, who wants to understand how things are interconnected, who feels that while the success rates are so low, no company can shy away from transforming, because competition fueled by now very small information gaps because of the internet, fueled by globalization, where your factories are now not vertically integrated, right? All that has promoted more competition, and therefore you realize that you have no choice but to transform. And transformation is no longer a project. It's a continuous activity every company needs to do. Competition is going to intensify. Nobody's thinking that competition is going to become less. And therefore, understanding that dilemma you face, you are looking for a new approach, because existing approaches have not worked. And hence, so much is being written off. In fact, the IDC estimates that in 2018, companies spent $1.3 trillion on transformation, of which, if you accept the high failure rates, almost $800 billion would have been wasted. So we are looking for executives who feel that there must be a better way going forward.
And what will these executives emerge from your program realistically being able to do?
They will come out understanding holistically the how a complex incumbent company operates, and how they can take these dimensions and elements, understand their interrelationships, and ask the right questions. Because their job is not to provide the right answer. They can, if they happen to be very well versed in a certain area, but often right at the top, your expertise are not going to encompass every single area that's required. But you need to be able to ask the right questions. And this program, therefore, equips you with the breadth. It's a breadth program. It equips you with the breadth. Let's put it this way, right? If you have a jigsaw puzzle you need to put together, but the cover is missing, that's going to be pretty difficult, right? You got no reference, right?
Next to impossible.
And I think that's a very good analogy of how business transformation is happening today. The covers are missing, and we are really providing those covers. So when you get back, you understand what are the levers that you must manipulate in order to get your transformation right. And that, I think, solves a majority of the problem. You're able to ask the right questions. You understand the fundamentals of what the working teams are trying to do. And therefore, you can be a much bigger value add to the organization having gone through this program.
So let me end with a question that I gather is one of your favorites to start with. Why did you create this program?
Well, as I myself went through, a very complicated transformation between 2017 to 2020 to build a digital bank in ASEAN, I realized that it is actually a monumental task. And I like to tell people that I've been very well schooled to undertake that transformation. I'm a computer engineer by training. I've written software. I've well versed in the management aspects. I have an MBA. I have a PhD in international business, and I've also done every single product role in the retail bank. And so in 2017, when this opportunity came about, I would say that I have much broader breadth than most executives. And yet, it was a very challenging experience. Many work streams, right? 15, 16 work streams that need to come together. We wrote million line of code, right? We brought out 500 over features. We did it in 2 countries that we don't live in, where we can't speak the language, where the norms are different. And so when I thought to myself, how can I leverage this knowledge, this learning to benefit other companies, I decided to come up with this methodology. And I felt the best way then to make impact was to teach as many people as I can this method. And we have to address this problem, right? Because we can't continue to have so much money poured into making companies competitive that is not having the desired effect. Something has to give. And I hope that this can be a new approach that can help companies better utilize their resources so that they can compete better in the new world.
Well, you're the man behind my favorite app, so I have to say personally, it's been a great pleasure for me to pick your brains and to hear your thoughts. All the best on your DTLP program. Dr. Dennis Khoo.
Thank you, Michelle. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with you.